Apologies. I think there was some people had trouble getting on with. For some reason, the link wasn't showing on the website, so I hope we'll see who manages to join. We actually have a reasonably full house back here, live in Shul. So if you wish to enjoy a coffee and some cake, please do rejoin us here in the Shul. So we were looking at influence of culture at the time and science at the time and law at the time on Torah, and there are several more areas that I want to have a look at, including actually going back to science and the influence of science on the Torah. But for now, I want to look at culture and law in Torah, and in particular spend some of our time looking at the comparisons made principally initially by the Bible critics, the comparisons between the Torah and other ancient codes and works that were floating around the ancient Near East at the time. So the very brief background to it is that there were a number of narrative texts floating around and a number of legal texts floating around. In particular, very famous is the Hammurabi Code and the Eshnuna Code and others. And these took different forms, but very often had multiple versions. We're not talking about an archaeological find of one document somewhere in the Middle East, but we're talking about very often stones or documents that were scattered around. These legal codes spread very far around the ancient Near East, and were used by courts and royal officials throughout empires, and very often jumped from empire to empire also. So these were very widely dispersed. It wasn't like there was just one copy sitting somewhere in the house of the king somewhere in the royal palace. And these became basic legal texts that were used very widely. There's a lot of discussion, which I'm not going to go into now, as to what degree they were practically used or they sort of presented a vision. The fact is they were there around in ancient Near East, and many of these are dated before the time of Matan Torah. So if you look, for example, in the Middle Assyrian codes, they're dated roughly the time of Matan Torah, or even a little bit later. If you look at Hammurabi's codes and various other texts, some of these predate Matan Torah by several hundred years. Now, if they predate Matan Torah, if they predate the giving of the Torah, then presumably the causal chain, if there is one, is from them to Torah rather than the other way round. In which case, argue the biblical critics, the Torah is a result of these legal codes, if we find and can evidence a causal chain, which is a big if. But if we can find that, then we know which one preceded which, and therefore we can work out that the Torah is a response or reaction or is modeled on these, which surely presents a problem to its divine image origin. So goes the claim. There's a similar claim put forward about the narrative texts of the Torah. So here we're talking about a bunch of narrative texts, which in fact I'm not going to mention now, so we'll split the narrative from the legal for now, and we'll focus on the legal, and then later we'll look at the narrative text. But again, for our purposes, we have narrative texts which predate the Torah, which seem to bear a remarkable similarity, so goes the claim, between these narrative texts and the Torah. So for example, if you find an ancient text that predates the Torah by several hundred years with a story of a flood, then we can assume that the Torah is taking a story from there since it predates the Torah. So goes the argument. Now, going back to legal texts, which will be our focus today, the argument goes that there is a remarkable similarity between many of the legal texts, in particular Hammurabi's code, which is several hundred years before Matan Torah, is certainly floating around the same part of the world as the Torah originated. It's around the empires of the ancient Near East. If Hammurabi is to be linked to the biblical figure of Nimrod, then we know certainly there's a contact between him and sort of our ancestors, but him and the others, as described in the Torah itself. And if we go through this text, so goes the claim, it's very similar in many instances. It's almost word for word the same as the descriptions in the Torah. It predates the Torah, and therefore surely the Torah is influenced and modeled on that text. And we have a very serious question around, so goes the claim, around the divine origins of the Torah. Now, I want to argue that almost every detail of what I said is seriously flawed and mistaken. And actually, we can very, very strongly assert that we need not be concerned in the least around these claims. And nonetheless, it is that there are arguments to be put forward that there is an impact of these legal documents and the ancient Near East culture and how Torah is framed in a very particular and nuanced manner, in which in no way threatens our emunah in the least, on the contrary, strengthens it, but also feeds into the topic of our discussion about whether the Torah is a product of a certain culture and setting, as per the argument of the view of the Rambam in Moed Nevuchim. So the arguments I'm going to put forward, I think will leave the extreme viewpoint on either side a little unsettled and uncomfortable, and actually shows us, I think, that there's a path through this which is a balanced one, which I do not think remotely needs to buy into the skeptical views of the biblical critics, and yet, on the contrary, is very much it does say interesting things about how the Torah works. I also want to acknowledge influences on these ideas. In particular, the Rambam obviously Moed Nevuchim is very much in line with the Rambam Moed Nevuchim. I mentioned Rav Nachum Rabinovitz, who speaks about these things. Rav Sachs speaks about them in certain cases. And after I prepared this series several years ago, both Professor Joshua Berman came out with a book, and Amnon Bazak from the Gush affiliated organizations came out with his Adayim Azeh, and there's a lot of overlap in what I'm going to be saying with some of these ideas. So this is not entirely original. I think it's a good summary of some of the thoughts that have been expressed by these thinkers and researchers.
Is there not going to bring someone of the Rambam from this how he sees
I'm not going to bring up some of the Rambam, partly because I spoke about it in my very first year, when I said that there's no doubt the Moed Nevuchim is taking a different stance to the Ramban and others. Equally, though, and I want to emphasize that the Rambam, who is the author of Moed Nevuchim, also is the author of the Ikar HaTashi, the 9th article of faith, which is very clear that there is that which is eternal and immortal and above time and space in the Torah. I'm simply arguing that the vehicle and the modes of expression and the language and the start of the journey in which the Torah sets is set in a certain context in the ancient Near East. Had it been set in a different society, a different place, then the start of the journey and the structure of how the halachas would be defined would have been different, but the core values and the core halachas remain the same. And again, I just want to say, for those that find this a little disturbing, and I understand that, because it can lead one to think, so, well, is this just contingent for a particular time and space? I'm not saying that, and none of us are threatened by the idea that the Torah has a very sophisticated set of laws of damages and nezikin about shor shenogach hasapora, about an ox goring. Anyone who has learned their way through those sugyas, or through Daf Yomi, or through halacha, it sees that out of Baba Mitzia, Baba Basra, Baba Kama, emerges a perfectly sophisticated legal system that can be adapted to modern scenarios, and yet can talk about shor shenogach hasapora. Similarly, you learn a Teshuvah of Ramosha Feinstein or Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and you can see how halacha can deal with cloning technology or other scientific developments. And again, it can take the trappings of a particular scenario and it can adapt it to modern situations. So we're familiar with this idea in essence. We're familiar with the idea that the Torah adopts the setting of 3,500 years ago to explain halacha, and presumably had a figure like Avraham Avinu arisen in Middle America, it would have taken scenarios that were suitable for Aztec or Inca Empire, and similarly had human development, chas v'shalom, been delayed till the 21st century. If humans would have still been around without a figure like Avram teaching us monotheism, then maybe shor shenogach hasapora would have been written as a Google car that crashes into a Tesla on automatic driving mode. But the core halachic values remain the same. So what I want to do is just try and explain very briefly the claims of comparison between the texts, then explain why I think these comparisons are flawed when used in the hands of the biblical critics, and then explain why in the hands of Ma'aminim, I think nonetheless, they are very, very interesting in light of the thought of the Rambam, who is confident and happy to see a causal chain. So basically, the claim of the biblical critics was, let's look through these texts, through these ancient, and now we're going to legal codes. We'll look later at narrative codes where there is some commonality. in what I'm saying. They said, let's look through these codes, and we see a number of points of contact, and we see common categories. So we see, for example, there's many areas that are dealt with in both the Torah and in these ancient Near legal codes. In particular, if you categorize the Torah into the laws of testimony, murder, rape, dishonest business dealings, theft, personal injury, adultery, you see basically a perfect alignment of categories. In many details, there's almost identical scenarios used. So, for example, when the Torah talks about injury, it talks about eye, tooth, hand, and leg. And when you look at ancient codes on the Near East, they also talk about these examples. The Torah talks about mishpatim, for example, damages that are done to a pregnant woman who's injured in a confrontation to two men fighting, and accidentally or on purpose, deliberately, a pregnant woman is attacked. And again, both codes use the same sort of language when they're talking about that. Similarly, some of the same legal distinctions are made. So famously in Sefer Dvarim, when a rape occurs, a distinction is made between whether this occurs in a city or an outlying field. If it occurs in the city, I shouldn't say rape, an attack or a relationship, an adulterous relationship occurs. If it's consensual, then both are held culpable. If it's non-consensual, then the victim is obviously not held culpable. And this is described in the Torah as a distinction between the city and the field. And again, the same sort of language used. So goes the claim. Now, obviously, there are differences also. So the Torah makes a claim as to authorship. It claims the author is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it's evident in the Torah that the crime is dealt with in many occasions as a crime not just against human beings, but also against HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this is woven into the text of the Torah again and again, that in halacha, this is a crime against Hashem, not just against a human being. And there are, by the way, nafkaminas or distinctions in how law works as a result. So when it is in the Torah, there isn't really the right of waiving a penalty, a capital penalty. You can't take financial compensation for a capital punishment penalty. The Torah weaves many laws together. So interwoven into some of these laws will be some of the Kedusha laws. There'll be some of the rules of Kohanim and Leviim and how these work. So again, there's an interwovenness between the legal systems. There's a context. So in the Torah, there may be in these legal ancient Near East law codes, there may just be a couple of lines saying this came from King so and so who wrote this. In the Torah, it's interwoven into narratives and into stories. In the ancient codes, there's often monetary penalties, even for what the Torah considers capital crimes. So, for example, there'll be distinctions between the status of the victim. If the victim is an upper class person, then maybe there'll be a capital punishment. If it's a lower class person or a servant, then there'll be financial penalties. In the Torah, we don't find those sorts of differences, and so on and so forth. So there are many differences between the two legal codes, and also many similarities. Now, obviously, those who are claiming these parallel texts are problematic for the divine authorship of the Torah. Recognize this point, and they say, well, of course, the Torah is a different document. Nonetheless, there's enough commonality that we can talk about shared origins of the two. Also, there's somewhat a sort of having your cake and eat it argument, which is, well, we can unpick the strands of the Torah. It is true that the Torah is a radically different sort of work. I can't stress enough how different the Torah also looks to these works. Right? If you look at the Torah, it's a narrative. It's the Chamisha Chumshei Torah is very much not a code of Hammurabi. If you look at the code of Hammurabi, you can get the translation online now. It has I think 282 clauses, and it reads like sort of more structurally like a Mishnah or something like that. It's just a set of rules. It's a set of instructions. Obviously, no machlokas in it. There's no argument in it. Mishnah is the first and most ancient legal code that embeds argumentation into the structure of how it's built. But it's just bullet points of instructions. The Torah is a radically different document. It's interwoven with story, with narrative, with messages about Kedusha, with our relationship with Hashem. And so it's a completely different work with a completely different feel to it. So if you buy into the idea of sort of unpicking various bits and pieces of text, and you're willing to cut and paste and say, no, the Torah is a composite document composed by numerous authors at different times, which has then been merged together, then you can extract a sort of Hammurabi-like code from it by cutting out everything else. So this feeds in yet again to some of the other assumptions that you make around how the text works. If you buy into some of the assumptions of biblical critics that we can cut and paste literally mid-posuk, thousands of times through the Torah, and it's a work which we have no evidence of any other work in the history of humanity, by the way, which has done this, in which several ancient documents are woven in and cut and paste in this sort of interwoven manner, with lines from each of which we know no other example in history of this occurring. If you buy into that, then you can extract a Hammurabi-like code from that by just taking certain sections of Mishpatim and SheBichtav and the various other legal parts of the Torah and create a code like that. But if you look at the text as we currently have it, as we understand it to be, Mishpatim is interwoven into a narrative section in which the Torah can talk about Shalosh Regalim in the middle of Mishpatim, it can talk about Trumas and Maasros, in which it weaves all sorts of other interesting things into it. So again, you get down to a value judgment in a sense about how you're going to view this document. I also want to mention that when this research first came out, it upended decades of assumptions of biblical critics, because the first stage of biblical criticism was that it was Ezra who created this work, this Torah work. Now, Ezra is roughly 2,500 years ago, by which stage no one really is interested in Hammurabi code. No one is looking at these ancient codes. When would you expect these ancient codes to influence the creation of the structure of the Torah? 3,500 years ago, right? When these ancient codes are prevalent throughout the Middle East. So if the Torah is influenced by them, you also have to admit an ancient origin to the Torah. Because when are these systems and laws adapted by the ancient Israelites? Around the time when this is the prevalent legal structure. By the time of Ezra, it'd be like us nowadays basing ourselves on and if we're creating a new legal code for a newly formed country, we're setting up a state of Israel in 1948. What do you model its legal code on? On that which is prevalent at the time. So it's a composite of British law because of British mandate and Ottoman Turkish law and so on and so forth. That's how a legal code is modeled by a new society which is creating itself and adapting itself. And if you're creating a newly formed country in an ex-colony, you might take American law and adapt it. You might take the colonial occupiers law and adapt it. You don't go back 1,000 years. No one's building law nowadays on Roman law. As much as Roman law is the sort of adapted legal system in many parts of the world, no one is going back 1,000 years or 2,000 years to what Roman law looked like. So to say that Ezra is taking and building a composite system, and therefore everyone's given up on that. This is accepted. No one is anymore claiming that these legal codes are created off the cuff by Ezra, going back to Hammurabi's code, which is barely around, if at all even accessible. We don't even know if by that stage anyone even has access to it. So in essence, the very claim that's being used in many respects is one which initially argued with many of the claims of the biblical critics, and actually has been used now as a source to push back a more ancient origins to the Torah. So if we accept an ancient origin to the Torah, what do we make of these comparisons nonetheless? And this is where we get to the more interesting discussion about some of the people are saying there are no sounds here. Are people able to hear me now? Yeah, okay, fine, sorry. Just in the chat group. Okay, so what do we do? What do we make about the comparisons nonetheless? I want to emphasize, by the way, also, I'm not here arguing for evidence of the divine origin of the Torah. That's not my discussion. I'm simply saying that for those who are ma'aminim and believe in the divine origin of the Torah, at the moment now, as the research currently stands, this question is not a smoking gun, though it is relevant to how we view the Torah as per the thoughts of the Rambam. What are we to make of the undoubted, nonetheless, comparisons between the two texts? So the first point to mention is that the Torah and these ancient texts are talking about the same culture. The Torah is written at that time, dealing with those situations. It's not surprising that it deals with the same basic scenarios. Some of these scenarios are eternals to human affairs, dishonesty in business, murder and rape, standards of evidence, contract law, damages. The examples given as to the scenarios of contract law or damages, again, you would expect to be the same sorts of scenarios. If you're writing a document 3,500 years ago, it's going to talk about Shashonaka Chasapara whether you are writing a Torah or whether you are Hammurabi trying to create a code for your part of the world, or for Hittite Empire, or for the Assyrian Empire. Again, you wouldn't be surprised at some level of commonality. It also isn't necessarily correct that the historic timing of the documents justifies the causal chain between the two. I mean, there are other models, right? Correlation is no evidence of causality. It's possible that both were influenced by a third source which precedes both of them, and both are derived from an earlier source. It's possible also that the chain of influence worked in a more original direction. It isn't quite correct to say that we believe the Torah only was given 3,500 years ago. It's true that's when the Torah was given, yet according to midrashic sources, and these are almost explicit in Torah SheBichtav, there are other God seekers around who had prophetic access to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and some insight to Torah law. So the Medrash talks about full-blown yeshivas of Shem ve'eva, right? The Medrash talks about the others, the Gemara talks about the others keeping kol haTorah kula. Now, what exactly these things mean, whether it means that they literally were keeping the Torah or they kept some other, comparable core value spiritual system, what exactly was going on in the yeshiva Shem ve'eva is part of the debate about how one learns Medrash. But the pasuk certainly references other godly sources going on preceding the formation of the Jewish people. The parsha that we just read, right? Rivka goes, Lidrosh Esakim, she goes to seek God's view. There are other sources. It doesn't mean she went to seek Yitzchak, her husband, otherwise it would say she asked Yitzchak what's going on. It means there are other sources of spiritual insight that the others considered valid. We have the encounter between Avram and Melchizedek, Melech Sholem, who's a Kohen, a Kel Elyon, who again is a non-pagan figure, according to Chazal, that of Shem. But whether again one takes it literally or not, the same figure, a different figure, there are godly figures around. Noach is again a non. This isn't Medrash. These are psukim which tell us about figures who had encounters with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and interaction. According to Chazal, the Bnei Noach mitzvah on Sheva mitzvahs Bnei Noach, one of which is dinim, is the area of justice. And presumably, there are spiritual seekers, people who have a genuine and meaningful relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, like whoever the Elokim who Rivka encounters, like Melchizedek, like Shem, like Noach, who are making a serious attempt to form a system of justice and din, and possibly quite like Avram, trying to teach people about this. Avram himself goes around on Vayikra b'Shem Hashem. He's interacting with the people around. He's described as a Nasi Elokim. He's known as a prince Hashem to the Bnei Ches. Bnei Ches, again, are very far from Avram's worldview, but they recognize that Avram is a Nasi Elokim. We don't know what it means to be a Nasi Elokim. How was he viewed by society? But he was someone who was going around teaching things. And therefore, the idea that thinkers in the ancient world arrived at a system of mishpat, which has some analogy to the mishpat in the Torah, again, shouldn't be a complete surprise. We have expectation of that. Chachma, Goyim Tamin, believe that there is genuine spiritual insight, not Torah Goyim, but believe there is insight into how to live and things to do, and an expectation for the non-Jewish world, as much as the Jewish world, to form a system of dinim, to form a system of justice. So what I've said so far, just to summarize, is that there is a claim of similarity between the Torah and documents and codes in the ancient Near East, both legal and narrative. We're not going into the narrative now, that's another topic, but the legal codes of the Torah. And there are similarities, there's no doubt there are similarities. They deal with similar scenarios, with similar terms, in some case, very similar terms, and it's not untrue to say that one can see genuine points of contact, probably too many to put it down as a pure coincidence. On the other hand, these texts are radically different. The Torah is a completely different work to a legal code in the past, to a sort of a narrative, to a something like Hammurabi's code, both in terms of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem being interwoven into it, the concept of Kedusha, the narrative, and its understanding of how a legal code, of how human responsibility works. And therefore, it equally could be viewed as a very different text, depending on the assumptions that one goes in. If one's willing to unpick it in a sort of biblical criticism type manner, then you can draw out something that's somewhat similar to Hammurabi Code. If you view it as an interwoven text, as we do, a text that has a unity to it, then again, this doesn't seem to be ostensibly to be a problem. If anything, it's evidence of a very ancient Torah. Again, that doesn't mean that the biblical critics are wrong. It simply means that one of their major building blocks, that the Torah was relatively recent, seems to, this is one of the pieces of evidence that at least that is not correct. And we shouldn't be surprised by similarity in culture, in dealing with the same culture in a time which is similar. In addition, the Torah never made a claim of being yesh me'ayin, something from nothing. It acknowledges that it is part of a even a pre-Matan Torah relationship to Hashem, in which there are figures, very few of which we know, but we know of some of them, Noach, Avram, Shem, Eva, Melchizedek, and so on, who have a relationship with Hashem. The Torah has an expectation of dinim, that the non-Jewish world should form dinim, B'nai Noach should have a system of justice, and therefore it shouldn't surprise us that there is some level of overlap and commonality between the two. What I now want to argue, though, is first of all to outline just specifics of points of difference, and then argue that even these points of difference are too interesting and similar to deny that there is nonetheless a relationship between the two, and therefore to argue that much like in the earlier part of what we were speaking about, we said the Torah is speaking to people at the time and trying to, in a meaningful way, to them convey the eternal truths of Torah. I think, according to the Rambam, we can argue that the legal text of the Torah, the mishpatim of the Torah, is also framed in a way which is directed to people at the time and trying to send them on a journey of greater insight and greater understanding and greater connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Or to put this in its more radical Moreh Nevuchim formulation, to argue that we can accept that there is even a causal impact between how people at the time were thinking, as expressed by something like Hammurabi's Code, and how the Torah phrases it, because the Torah is taking it and using this as a springboard for what it considers to be true mishpat and true justice. So this is what I'm going to argue in the thinking of the Rambam. Now, I'm just going to give several examples. I went through, to the best of my ability, I think there are 282 rules there in the Code of Hammurabi, and I'm really not an expert in this. And as I said, I've done a lot of reading around this, and a lot of the stuff is really above even a genuine attempt of a layperson to make sense of this. A lot of the debate is in many of these areas is around complexities of translation and interpretation and things like that. This is really very complicated. However, and this is well known, this is already pointed out by the Hertz Commission and others, 100 years ago, there are serious differences between the two codes. So I want to share with you a couple of the differences which are classics, which you can find 100 years ago in the Hertz Commission, and a couple which I think are more recent. I haven't seen others writing about, and I just want to share. And one of them is really, really fascinating. So the classic differences that are pointed out is, for example, one that I mentioned, that the Hammurabi Code consistently makes a difference between class. So the difference between whether you're a commoner, a slave, a king, a noble. We don't find any such message in the Torah. In halacha, there is a commonality, whether you have killed or injured or raped a commoner or a noble. Both of these, all of these are treated in the same way. In fact, one of the common messages of the Torah, probably one of the great themes of the Torah, if we look at the Torah and its great themes, so there's a theme of Kedusha, there's a theme of Yetzias Mitzrayim, there's several themes of the Torah. One of the themes of the Torah is treating the ger, the yosef, the almana, the vulnerable and the weak and the poor, the oni, and so on in society, with equality. Some of the comparisons actually help us understand better what the Torah is saying. And I'll give here a couple of examples, one of which I think is very famous and one of which is less well known. The Torah tells us the law in Mishpatim of a shur, an ox, goring a victim. And it says that the shur, the owner of the shur is punished. It's not murder, so the owner of the shur is not put to death, because ultimately he didn't kill someone, he was negligent in his care of the ox. Nonetheless, payments should be made by the owner of the ox, and in some cases the ox is also put to death if it's a dangerous animal, and so on and so forth. Now, when the Torah is speaking, after explaining all these halachas, it then says that if the ox gores a ben obas, a son or a daughter, then again, according to this mishpat, should be done to the person. So we are left wondering, why would the Torah put this? Make this point. The point is, if it gores any victim, you're chayiv to pay, or the owner of the ox is chayiv to pay and is culpable. And why would the Torah stress, if it's done to a son or a daughter, that the owner should be punished? And the answer to this is because this is a common theme in Hammurabi's code, that if my ox does damage to your son or daughter, then my son and daughter are punished. If I'm a builder and I build a poor building and that collapses and kills you, then I am punished. If it collapses and kills your children, then your children are punished. So the Torah's emphasis, for example, in this parsha, on not on the he should be punished, is probably part of the famous other sequence of psukim that we have in Devarim. We don't have this in Mishpatim, of lo yom to avos albanim, etc., that the child shouldn't be punished for their parents' children sins, and the children shouldn't be punished for their parents' sin. And again, this is a sort of common pattern in the Torah, in which actually it helps us understand what the Torah is doing. It adds a peirush to the Torah, in which we understand that the Torah is coming la'afuke, to exclude and to contrast and to say differently to how the codes at the time understood it. Now, on the one hand, this is a very clear pattern, and I'll share another couple of examples with this. On the other hand, it seems to emphasize what the Rambam tells us in Moed Avachim, which is we can only really understand the Torah if we understand the context in which it was given. And at least on a Peshat basis, we know the Torah can be interpreted on many levels, but on a Peshat basis, there's a reason in the Psukim which we can uniquely understand now that we can compare the Torah to other codes at the time, and we can see, the Torah is writing this to contrast with how the Hammurabi code wrote it. So we learn Torah on a multi-tiered level. So in Drush, we will ask, Klal Prat, why does the Torah say the general rule of punishing, and indeed this is what the Gemara does, the general rule that a person who's done an injury has to pay, and then give a prat of only if it's a ben or bas you have to pay, and the Gemara's Dorish halachas from it, and this is one level of reading in it. If you look in the Orach Chaim and the more midrashic commentaries in the Torah, it will give another reading of the Psukim. If you learn Peshat, we have now had insight into a third layer of reading the Psukim, that this helps us understand. This is coming to contrast with the way the codes at the time saw things. So this helps us better understand the Torah, as the Rambam argues when it comes to Avodah Zarah, in which the Rambam said you can only really understand the chukim of the Torah if you understand what were the prevalent beliefs at the time. In other words, when the Torah writes various isurim of chukim, the core issa and the core value, as the Rambam says in the Ikar Tashi, is something which is above time and space, and Chas v'Shalom are not coming to rewrite the Torah, but the way it is explicated, the way it is formed, the framework which it's put into is one which is contrasting to pagan worship at the time. Similarly, even in Mishpatim, we now understand the way the Torah writes it is coming to contrast with other legal systems at the time. But I now want to share with you something which I maybe others have also pointed out. I'm sure they have, but I haven't seen this so clearly. And this is a series of clauses in the Hammurabi Code about the relationships between slaves and masters. And I just want to read to you one of them. And this is the very last one, which is perhaps the reason why I noticed it, 282. And it says, if a slave, this is from online, the translation goes, if a slave says to his master, you are not my master, if they convict him, his master shall cut off his ear. And this is really interesting. A slave says to his master, you're not your master, you're not my master. So a slave is claiming I'm a free man, or at least you're not my master, someone else's. They're lying making a lying and denying ownership. So if they convict him, so it goes to court, and the court brings evidence that indeed this is his master, then he shall cut off the ear of the slave. Now, to me, again, this gives us an illumination of a layer of Torah that we would never have understood in the past, because the Torah says the opposite. If a Eved says, I want you to be my master, I want you to stay as my master longer, what do? We pierce the ear of the slave. Now, again, there's multiple dimensions to understand this. I'm not coming to offer uniquely alternative explanations. Chazal speak about why it's the ear, and obviously Torah is understood on a multi-tiered level. The ear that heard on Sinai, that you only Hashem should be your master, is pierced because this person says, I want to be a servant of a servant. Avodai heim, you are my servant. So avodim, you're not meant to be servants or servants. But isn't it interesting that the Torah takes something and makes it the exact opposite of what the Hammurabi's code says? First, it diminishes it. We're not cutting off the ear, we're merely piercing the ear. Of course, we're not going to cut off the ear. But secondly, it chooses the unique opposite of what the code says. The code says, if a slave says, you are not my master, and it turns out that the slave is lying, his ears cut off, the Torah says a slave who wants to continue to being a slave has their ear pierced. So I think this is perhaps another example of an insight of where the Torah takes the prevalent legal system and sort of turns it on its head and adapts it and tweaks it to say to the people, I want you to give the exact opposite message to what the Torah says, to what the external legal systems say. So what I'm arguing over here is that and again, this is very much in line with what the Rambam is really telling us in his Mo'en Avachim, is that if we understand the surroundings at the time, it gives us deeper insight into the Torah. This need not threaten our emunah. On the contrary, it reveals a layer of beauty in the Torah, in which the Torah is contrasting with the situation at the time, but also in terms of the topic of what our discussion is, which is to what degree is the form which the Torah takes influenced by the time. The answer is it's speaking to Klal Yisrael living 3,500 years ago, embedded in a certain culture, and it's moving them forward from that point. And it's saying, in contrast to how other legal codes view avdus as being a permanent situation in which any attempt to change it should be punished by a blow, an infliction on the ear, we're going to say, give that punishment to an Eved who, on the contrary, sees his situation as permanent, sees themselves in such a situation of despair or hopelessness or inability to function that they want to stay la'olam, they want to stay forever, which we understand to mean to yovel, and they say, I want to stay as an Eved forever, and I'm not willing to go free and return to my responsibility as a free person. So to me, this is a very beautiful reading of the Pesukim, and I think one which demands of us to walk a nuanced path. On the one hand, to recognize that the Torah is not, chas v'shalom, merely a cut and paste from a secular legal system, is one that reflects eternal divine values. And on the other hand, in the thinking of the Mo'en Avachim, it is acceptable to say that the Torah chooses a structure which is modeled and affected by the situation at the time. And then there are numerous other examples of where the Torah modifies things, and I chose this one because, to my mind, it's the most striking example where you see in the context of avdus a cut through the ear. But again, looking at the last laws. In 229 and 230, for those of you who are interested, if a builder builds a house for someone and doesn't construct it properly, and the house which he builds falls in and kills the owner, then the builder shall be put to death. And if it kills the son of the owner, then the son of the builder shall be put to death. The Torah modifies this twice. First of all, it says chas v'shalom, the punishment doesn't go on the son of the perpetrator, it always goes on the perpetrator. And second, it changes the punishment. Since it's indirect, it's carelessness, there's no death penalty, there is a monetary punishment. Similarly, so here we find the Torah tweaking a death penalty to a monetary punishment, and similarly we find the Torah sometimes tweaking a monetary punishment to death penalties. So, for example, the Torah says if someone kills an Eved, the Hammurabi's code says if someone kills an Eved, then they should pay a penalty. If the perpetrator is a freeborn man, then they only pay money, they don't get put to death. There's a complex system in which we work out the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim. And if they are of the same class, then it will be a death punishment. If one is of an upper class and one is of a lower class, then there will be punishment related accordingly to their class distinction, how much money is paid. The only case where we make a similar distinction is where? Is in Poshes, right? Of the financial penalties paid. If you injure someone, you always have to pay healing, you always have to pay loss of money, you have to pay compensation for lost work, you have to pay for the pain. And the only case where we make a distinction in the status of the figures is in terms of embarrassment, because embarrassment obviously is affected by social class sometimes, but we'll take into account other factors also, how public it was, how private it was. But one of the factors that we'll use for social class is embarrassment. Then again, it has a similar pasuk to the pasukim at the end of Mishpatim that speak about someone who hits a woman and causes a miscarriage. If a man strikes a freeborn woman so that she loses her unborn child, he shall pay money for it. If the woman dies, then his daughter shall be put to death. So again, the same idea, a consistent theme that runs through Hammurabi's codes of the children being punished if it affects someone else, rather than the person themselves being punished. In fact, Chazal say that one of the reasons why in certain situations we need to modify the punishment on Eidim Zomimim of a Sisim Lo Kasher Zomam Lasei Slachiv, and one should punish someone as they plotted to do to someone else, is because if someone affected their victim's descendants, we can't punish the perpetrator's descendants. So this is a basic theme that runs through the Torah, that we don't punish the perpetrator's descendants because of an impact on the victim's descendants. So to summarize, in terms of our topic, I think if we dip into, is the Torah in some way reflecting the society at the time, and some way influenced by the society at the time in which it's written? The answer is a nuanced and cautious yes, alongside a nuanced and cautious no. Is it a straight out cut and paste, as Chas v'Shalom is argued by the critics? Absolutely not. Is it possible that by understanding some of the parallel texts, we can see and understand better the context in which the Torah is writing, and understand how it's directly coming and often clashing head on with the values at the time in order to modify how we view things? Then yes, it's possible that the Torah wrote this extra pasuk of if a son or daughter is killed, in order to contrast to how the code was at the time. It's possible the Torah gave the punishment of the ear for many other symbolic reasons, as outlined by Chazal, but perhaps also choosing that particular method of expression in order to contrast with the Hammurabi's code at the time, in which the ear is being punished as a consequence of the desire to go free. Any thoughts or comments? Yes.
How does that square with the medrash about the Torah being created 2,000 years? We don't have to apologize to them, because if Hashem has created the essence of the Torah, and the actual Torah itself, black and white, and that idea, then they're obviously following us. That was set in stone, as it were, before the world was created. So it's very difficult to square the circle in that.
Okay, so there's several points. That the question being asked is about the medrash that says the Torah has preceded Ma'aseh Bereishis by Alpayim Shana, by 2,000 years. I did address this right at the beginning. It's a fair question. If one understands that the text of the Torah is set in stone Alpayim Shana, 2,000 years before creation, then you're correct, and that's the end of this whole series. There's nothing further to say. The text of the Torah as we have it is above time and space, and therefore not in the least influenced by anything contingent or circumstantial at the time, and that's absolutely correct. When I started the share, I explained that this topic is quite a sensitive subject, both because of that understanding and because the Nosin Torah, the giver of the Torah, is above time and space, and therefore why should we expect the Torah to be found within time and space at all? In addition, at least when it comes to the mitzvahs, the Rambam tells us in the Ikar Tashi, in the 9th principle of faith, that everything in the Torah is eternal and will not be altered. And then we have a stream of midrashim, such as the one you quoted about Alpayim Shana, and such as the language of the Mekabolim and Zohar, of Istakel Barais, or Bara Alma. HaKadosh Baruch Hu looked in the Torah and created the world. And Eish Dos, the midrashim on the V'zos HaBracha, we speak about the Torah being before Ma'aseh Bereishis as being Eish Shechora, Al Gabe Eish Levana, and so on and so forth. So we have a series of midrashim that write about that.
Say anything about religion at all?
No, it doesn't. No, in the preamble, it makes divine claims for the authorship of the code, but beyond that, it doesn't. So what do we do with all these midrashim? First of all, the question is how one understands these midrashim. Does the midrashim mean the text of the Torah is fixed, or does it mean the core values of the Torah are fixed? What are we meant to make of the narrative portions of the Torah that talk about freely chosen choices? Abraham is given a Nisayon. Presumably he has Bechira, whether to pass the Nisayon or not, and yet the Torah tells us about it. It tells us about the rebellion of Korach, the rebellion of the Meraglim, the death of Moshe, the conversation between Mitzrayim. It tells us about many mitzvahs which we do because of leaving Mitzrayim. So presumably, whilst the core value of the Torah, the Beis Halevi speaks about this. He says it's possible that, for example, when we talk about Avraham eating matzahs before Matan Torah, right, the midrashic sources that says he ate matzahs, is because it's reflecting some of the core values. The value of Cherus is one that precedes Yetzias Mitzrayim, but the expression and the way this is actions in terms of the history of the Jewish people came about through a series of free choices. Avram's free choice in the Brisbane Habasorim to ask Hashem b'ma Eida, the choice of the brothers to fall out with each other and sell Yosef down to Egypt, the choice of Yaakov to go down to Egypt, the choice of Paro to resist the calls on him to free the Jewish people. So there's a series of human free choices which led to the story unraveling in the way that it did. So the shape that the Torah takes is it doesn't seem difficult to argue that this is affected by the circumstances at the time. And if one's looking for sources in the Rishonim, the Rambam again says this very clearly. And again, I called this series originally as a subtitle, that we've drifted a long way from this in the thoughts of the Rambam and Utsato. And I'm aware that we've drifted a long way from that subtitle, but there's no doubt that this is part of the machlokas between the Mekabalim and the Rambam and his school of thought as to how to view these matters. I'm not claiming exclusivity here at all. There are, and it deserves to be put on the record, there are many other approaches to these matters. There's no doubt that if you look at the history of Jewish thought, the majority of Jewish thought has not gone with this path of the Rambam and those who are with him. It's gone with the sort of more mainstream approach, which doesn't delve into these matters and doesn't look at anything contingent within the Torah. And certainly, when it comes to halacha, nothing here is meant to even remotely impact our strength of belief in the immutability of the halachas of the Torah. Nonetheless, what I'm sharing is an approach of the Rambam, and for those that do engage in these matters, often we find this approach helpful, and it helps us relate to the Torah. So, for me, I think this is something worthwhile sharing, and something that offers a different approach, and the Rambam seems very comfortable with this. So, Leonard, do you want to ask something else?
That's basically based on that.
So we'll stop there for today. In Yirtzeh Hashem, next week we will look at the narrative of the Torah, and I mentioned the Rambam and his school of thought. There are others that go with the Rambam, so I will share with you a Ralbag, who was a Rishon, was a couple of generations after the Rambam, who also follows his way of thinking around the narrative text of the Torah. And we'll also look at some of the narrative claims that there's a similarity between the narrative in the Torah and the Torah itself. And again, we'll see that I think the Torah responds to the rival narratives that were around, but isn't a product of those rival narratives. And maybe that line summarizes the point that I'm trying to make. To argue that this is a product of, I think is problematic. To argue that this is a response to is very much in line with the thinking of the Rambam in the Mona Vachim. I'm not claiming this is a mainstream. There's many Rishonim, probably most Rishonim, we don't agree. But the Rambam argues, as I quoted from Mona Vachim, he says, whilst the giver of Torah is above time and space, we human beings are the recipients of Torah, and we are not above time and space. And the Torah needs to be given to us as the Makabale Torah. And therefore the Torah is put in a form in which it speaks to us as human beings. And we'll see other examples of how far the Rambam and others took the concept of Dibra Torah, Koloshim B'nei Adam, the Torah speaks in the language of human beings. But for today, we'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.